Best Book Bits podcast brings you Beth Rashleigh, is the author of Crisis-Proof Leadership. With almost 2 decades of experience helping leaders be their best, Beth shares the practical knowledge and personal experience to inspire others. After working in several large healthcare organizations and a central intelligence agency, she knows how to empower and inspire leaders to create the wholehearted, high-performance teams. Beth, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, than's for having me. It's my pleasure.
No worries. Just to start off, fantastic book, by the way. I read it recently, Crisis-Proof Leadership, and yeah, just a really good book. Talk to me about your background, your experience, and how your story unfolded after your education.
Yeah, I after college, I kind of jumped right into the human resources world. I'm a people person by nature and was really fascinated by how I could support and help others. And that was kind of a natural fit for me. Pretty early on, though, I figured out the part of human resources that I really loved was the training piece. I didn't really love the part where an employee was struggling and we were dealing with it, through firing or through a formal write-up. I would much rather be on the front side of let's try to make that person as successful as possible before something goes wrong. So that side of the business was really fascinating to me, and I gravitated towards it. And most of my career has been spent in training and development in some way, shape, or form. And I really solidified into that leadership space, probably 12 or 13 years ago, and never looked back. My passion is absolutely helping leaders be their best and supporting them so that they can, create really high functioning, happy teams.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Working with the CIA, that would have been an interesting experience. Did you work alongside Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible? No.
Yeah, no, sadly, no Tom Cruise. Although my particular cup of tea would have been Ben Affleck and some of Ben Affleck's films. But yeah, I spent 8 years there. Really, really loved my work there and did a variety of different types of training jobs before I settled into the leadership development space there. And it was just a gift of a job. I loved it. Would still be there, except I was ready to relocate out of the DC area.
Yeah. Tell us, how did the book come about, and what is the book about in a nutshell?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I went out on my own, and I've been working one-on-one with clients a lot. I do a lot of leadership coaching and team development work, leadership development. And of course, as soon as the pandemic hit, I feel like it came at leaders quickly. And a lot of my clients were really struggling with how to manage amongst the just multitude of crises that were happening all the time. Seemed like every day something new was happening. You're now working remote. You're now having to work with a reduced budget. Just every day it was something new. And as I was working with leaders and trying to help them solve these problems, I got really interested in, okay, what does the research tell us? What is best practice here? How should we be handling ourselves as leaders in these types of big, massive crises? And I got really fascinated because the research just wasn't great. Like, what's out there just wasn't particularly helpful to the type of environment that we're working in right now. Because old school crisis management, crisis leadership books, they really focus on, okay, crisis happens, you're a leader, you're going to take out this toolkit of tools and you're going to do these special things for X amount of days until the crisis is over. And that's just not the type of event that happens anymore. When you really dig into what a crisis is, it's some sort of unexpected surprise thing that threatens the health of your organization and requires you to continue to make high quality leadership decisions. If you think about crisis through that lens, think about how often, if you're in a leadership position that happens to you, it's sometimes a couple times a week. That everything from a reorg to somebody quit and isn't on your team anymore. The amount of things that can happen quickly that require that kind of focus, it happens a lot. So I was really compelled to say, okay, let's look at crisis different. And that's what really led me into writing the book. Didn't have big intentions to write a book until I started digging into that. I thought there was a need for it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And in the book you talk about obviously the pandemic that hit everyone, and everyone understands now a little bit about what a crisis is and what that can do for companies, employees, people's mental health, financial health as well, and physical health too. So it's really hit everyone for six. so to speak. You jump into a couple stories and you talk about, people struggling during the pandemic, and there was one lady named Monica that you talk about where she was able to continue to lead and even thrive during the crisis and after the crisis, where some people obviously didn't, and you wondered if she was unique or part of a larger trend, and what you found has she transformed the way you thought about crisis leadership as well. Can you talk a little bit about, you talk about burnout, so job burnout's been recognised as an occupational phenomenon. World Health Organization added burnout to the list, and now it's an official medical diagnosis. Talk to us about burnout, what it is, and what's it all about.
Yeah, burnout is, again, pre-pandemic, burnout was already high. It was already the highest levels we'd ever see. Add a pandemic and a bunch of things that have happened on top of that. And we're seeing burnout rates that we've never seen before. And burnout is really about a combination of both that like mental exhaustion, but that it's related to your engagement at work. So, you become so overwhelmed, so just stressed that you're no longer able to bring the same level of effort and engagement and passion to work anymore. And the research shows us that, sadly, the only thing that really, truly is effective at burnout, at reducing those burnout symptoms, is a break away from work. And that has been really, really difficult for people to get. Again, I work with a ton of clients in the healthcare space. There has been no break. There's been a couple, at least in America, there's been a couple of downtrends in the virus, but for the most part, there hasn't been a break for a really, really long time. So again, really difficult to actually effectively address those burnout issues. And, also I think culturally, we're just at this moment where employees are recognizing that maybe things don't have to be this way. Maybe we can think about work in a different way, and we don't have to experience these symptoms at the level we've been experiencing them. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's the positive that's come out of this, is a lot of people are feeling empowered to take care of themselves in a different way.
Well, in the book, you talk about it's hard for leaders and managers at the moment as well, because they're now dealing with a trifecta of leadership challenges, which is, a burnt out workforce. You talk many who are now leading remotely, so working remotely, and also a growing mental health crisis as well. So very hard to, organize a team or stay positive as well. And you also say, the strongest and toughest and most cutthroat leaders would be the ones that thrive in this environment, but research has found the opposite. So you talk really greatly about having that high, empathetic, focused on values and value-driven leadership. It's been able to better keep their teams engaged and thriving as well. Can you sort of expand on that a little bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, so many of the qualities of effective leaders are really, for me, rooted in that servant leadership philosophy, which is, I'm here as a leader to care for you as a team member. And research shows us time and time again, that kind of philosophy is the most effective leadership strategy, not just at engaging your team and retaining your team, but it also gets better business results. People and organizations that embrace that kind of servant leadership culture, they do better, they perform higher, they're on the Fortune 500 list more often. So it's not just lip service, it's not this nice thing that we should do. It's actually effective. It's the best method that you could use. And so leaders who lead with that philosophy, they're self-aware, they know who they are, they know what's important to them, they're able to tap in and build strong relationships with their teams as people, not just as cogs in a machine, but as humans. And they're able to meet those people where they are, help grow them, help them tap in to the potential that's inside of them. And those are really the most successful leaders. And what I found in my work, so outside of crisis, those leaders that were already doing those things in crisis also were the most effective, which isn't surprising, but also really, I think, hits home the importance of developing strong leadership skills as soon as humanly possible if you're going to do this kind of work, because it's those kind of foundational skills that'll help you be the most successful.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And speaking of foundational skills, talk about a little bit of your experience when you finished college and you were hired as a recruiter, small Indianapolis area country hospital. What's your experience like there? And, shattering and learning and finding your purpose of but helping people become the best leaders that the world needs.
Yeah. So when I first started out in my career, like you mentioned, I was in this kind of smaller county hospital in Indiana, and I was new to healthcare. I didn't know anything about it, and suddenly I was responsible for hiring nurses and hiring radiology techs. And I didn't really know what the work was, and I didn't really know what it took to be a really great nurse, and I didn't know the difference between a really great ER nurse and a really great ICU nurse. Those are different skill sets. They're different types of nurses. And so the thing that really helped me, and I would say has been a cornerstone of my career, my entire career, is that I was willing to go in and say, okay, teach me, let me shadow, let me learn what these jobs are. And I spent a lot of time on hospital floors, just, okay, tell me what somebody does and let me explain it, let me watch it, let me understand it in a way that I can go out and find you candidates that look like these really successful nurses in your area. And so I did all that work, and that was going really well. And I was building up some street cred with the, nurses and the managers that were there. And then I noticed that I had another problem, which was, okay, I would find this perfect nurse that was a great fit for this unit, and then they would leave like 6 months later. And I noticed pretty quickly there was a trend between the areas where I knew we had weak leadership and the areas we were struggling in turnover. And again, that's not rocket science, but as a 23-year-old, that was like mind-blowing to me. So I really started to dig into like, okay, how do we help these people be more effective leaders? Because I can keep finding you nurses all the time, but we're not getting anywhere. It felt like this, constant funnel of people in and out. And I knew in order to get anywhere, we were going to have to solve that problem too. So that's when I really got interested in what it takes to be a great leader.
Yeah, and the old saying goes, people don't leave bad jobs; they leave bad managers or bad leaders. So it's about having good leaders and retaining good staff. And at the end of the day, no one needs to be. People leave environments and cultures because they don't align with their values or where they're going as well. So I guess what you're doing is a great job, which is creating those great leaders, which creates great cultures and great places to be around as well, and great atmospheres. Moving on the book, chapter 1, we deep dive a little bit into crisis and leadership, and you talk about the definition of what crisis is, but I'm not going to read the official definition, but what is your definition of what a crisis is? And if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so that it's those elements that I mentioned. So it's, there's some sort of event that's a threat to the organization. So something happens, we're at threat. It's also it's going to have a component of surprise. We didn't know this was happening. This wasn't something that was on our strategic plan. And then lastly, you're going to need to make quick decisions still. And that combination makes for a really interesting kind of petri dish of potential issues for leaders if you're not prepared to do those things, and especially the decision-making skill and the ability to continue to make really great people-centered decisions while you're in that crisis. That it's just critical.
And then also you deep dive into crisis naturally creates opportunities for vision, alignment, motivation, inspiration, and people are more naturally intrinsically motivated because the goal is clear, and you can capitalize on those things and make a difference during times of crisis, which I guess with anything, not just work, but family crisis, health crisis, anything, as you said just before, which is a threat. Let's say it's a health, right? So let's just use the virus. So a threat to your body, it's element of surprise, and then it's a short decision time, meaning you've got to make quick decisions. But from a crisis comes that opportunity to make a new start or a new change or something new that changes the bedrock or foundation of what you thought, or changes a belief or a habit. Do you want to expand on any of that? Just not just the workplace, but how these elements can, can bleed into sort of your personal life as well, and how we can deal with crisis from a personal level.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of my work in leadership development, I hope my impact long term, like sometimes, you think about, okay, what does it look like when I retire? Like, what does somebody say about me? And I hope one of the things that is true for my work is that in making leaders better, I make families better. Because when you have a really hard leader, when you've got an ineffective leader, that bleeds so heavily into your personal life, right? We've all worked for those before. Your stress levels higher, your engagement levels higher. People are clinically proven to get sick more often when they're unhappy at work or working for a leader that is ineffective. So those kinds of effects absolutely bleed into our home life. If you were frustrated and upset all day at work, you walk in the front door and that's what your kids get, So I think, we can't underestimate the impact that leaders have. And I have a friend who always says, the second you become a leader, you basically just became the subject of dinner around every table of every team member that you have. And it's important work. It's not work that should be taken lightly or stepped into without some consideration, because your ability to impact that as other people is really, really high.
Yeah. And I guess the big elephant in the room as well, not just with stress, but sort of day-to-day things. Sorry, not just with day-to-day things, is stress. So it's an underlying thing that a lot of people don't talk about. So you talk about leadership and stress, and especially crisis. So crisis often creates higher than usual amounts of stress. And research shows that, stress impairs our core cognitive functions, which is not new. No, for years, we believed that stress sharpened our brains, but research has established that stress makes decision-making more irrational, hurried, and systematic as well. Do you want to expand a little bit about how stress can sort of impair working memory, increase distractions, lower reaction times, and reduce our very ability to process information, and how bad stress is for the overall environment, not just with work, but it bleeds out into your personal life as well, and how we can actually fix this as well, or overcome stress?
Yeah. So, what happens to our bodies the second stress happens, and, sadly, our bodies haven't evolved at the same pace that our environment has. The second stressor or crisis happens, we go right to our primitive brain, that back part of our brain that feels emotion, helps us decide whether we're going to run or we're going to hide. It's absolutely that fight or flight part of our brain. That part of our brain's really good at making those instinct-based, gut level decisions, but it's terrible at everything else. It's absolutely terrible at everything but being upset, trying to decide whether to run or hide. And what happens is, if you're in that state for too long, you're suddenly making, let's pretend now suddenly you've got to make a budget decision, but your brain's, your body is still flooded with all these chemicals that are just about, are we going to run or are we going to stay? So, there's no goodness that comes from that. There's no effective decision that comes from that. It's just lousy decision making. So the best thing we can do is pause, breathe, get curious, ask a question. The second you do something like that engages the front part of your brain that's much more effective at all those things. But again, that takes awareness of both, what does stress look like for you? Can you notice it in your body when it happens? So you can notice, ooh, I might be making a stress decision here instead of a good, clear, rational decision. There's also some really fascinating research. Again, this is tied to burnout. I read a great book called Burnout that has dug into some research around, again, those biological chemical things that are happening in our bodies. Let's say the stress is an email. You see an email that gets you triggered in some sort of way. Again, biologically, what's happening is you're getting flooded with adrenaline, stress hormones are kicking in, because in the old days, you would have now had to run and flee a predator. Those same chemicals are still in your body, and it's just an email. And that email is only encouraging you to sit at your desk and write the email. And so one of the best things we can do from a stress perspective is figure out, how do you get those hormones out of your body? So for some people, that's, okay, let's go take a physical run. So can you move your exercise routine to the end of the day so that you can help your body release those stress hormones? And I have a couple clients that have experimented with that who used to be morning runners, and now they run at the end of the day. Game changer as far as just how the stress leaves their body. Really, really critical. Now, I know there's some great research about that. The morning workout might be better for your workout goals. But again, if you're doing exercise for some sort of stress release, much better to do it at the end of the day in order to let those chemicals out. For some people, it might be meditation or a yoga class, whatever that is, but you've got to let those stress hormones exit. And that is going to take some sort of physical or mental push to do that. And I got really fascinated by that research, because it's funny that our brains and our bodies haven't adapted as quickly as our environments has changed. At that hormonal level, we're still incredibly primitive.
Yeah, well, all the environments are somewhat artificial and fake environments. I mean, they're not natural to the ecosystem when we create these. We're in studios, we're in lights, we're in house. It's quite primitive. It's quite different from what sort of we're being programmed to do. But at the end of the day, stress can be good if you use it in the correct way, but it can be bad as well. Some of the things you talk about with crisis, leadership crisis responses, and they fall into 3 different buckets. So the first is the head in the sand leader. Says, some people are just slow to acknowledge and name what's going on. Instead of putting their plans in place, they deny that it's happening and I hope it goes away, similar to what happened with COVID at the start. People just denying that it existed, but it was really kicking off. Then there are people on the other side of the spectrum, which you like to call knee-jerk leaders. So these are leaders that tend to favor high levels of control and big sweeping, swift decisions that don't take into account anyone's emotional state. And then there's leaders who walk in the middle and lead with data, facts, and empathy. Is there anything you want to add or expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the model that I've come up with there is that really what we're trying to do is balance decision-making with staying connected with people. And that's really what's happening in those scenarios where we've got somebody who's, if you're a knee-jerk leader, you're quick to make the decisions, you're quick to kind of jump into action and, okay, I'm going to do all these things and that's going to make me feel better. And the action part of it is really soothing for you. But if you look behind you, there might be a bunch of people who are completely confused about what's happening and have no idea what you just made decisions about, right? It's really easy to leave people behind. If you're somebody who's a head in the sand leader, you're much more likely to you might be deeply connected with people. You might understand what's happening with them, but man, you're not making a decision to save your life. And it's really the sweet spot is, can you make effective decisions and consider people and keep people, connected and informed? That's really where the magic happens in those moments of crisis.
Yeah, thanks for expanding. And another little one to talk about as well is, one of the most common crisis situations that leaders want to hide from is the employee performance issues. And, you start to notice that things are getting missed or work isn't being completed according to procedure. And instead of providing feedback or training, you hope it will get better. And spoiler alert, it doesn't.
It doesn't, never does.
No, it's an issue. Like, if you're a leader or a manager and you're managing people, and especially people that are performing sort of subpar, people hide away from these performance issues. But if you nip it in the bud and you help with, this obviously helps with training and helps, increase effective employee engagement and actually getting the work done. Can you expand a little bit about why managers and leaders sort of shy away from employee performance issues?
Well, first, it's scary, right? Like it's you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody. And unfortunately, for many of us, maybe you haven't experienced that in a really positive way or really effective way. You've only experienced that as an ineffective feedback conversation. So you don't know what good looks like. You don't know what to do. You don't know the mechanics of it. So it seems really terrifying. For a lot of people too that are people pleasers, I deal with a lot of leaders, especially in the healthcare space, who are kind of chronic people pleasers. So to give somebody like a critical piece of feedback is like their worst nightmare, right? Because I know I'm going to upset you potentially. But the magic in a really great feedback conversation, it doesn't take a ton to be great at it. It's really about balancing accountability and some real kind of truth telling about performance with deeply caring about that other person and framing things in a way that they can hear. So there's a dramatic difference between me saying, Michael, that thing that you did yesterday was a disaster and I need you to not do it that way again, versus me walking into a meeting with you and saying, you know what, Michael, I noticed something yesterday and I am so committed to your growth and development. I think you're such a rock star. That this thing I noticed, I'm really concerned might be hanging you up. Would you be open to having a conversation about what I noticed? It's a completely different conversation, right? Like you're much more likely to hear that second conversation and be like, yeah, I'd love to hear your point of view on what happened. I want to get better. I appreciate you. Different framing, it's really what it's all about. But for so many leaders, you just don't get that training. And you often are not experiencing that from your own leader. So you don't have that kind of solid role model for it. So I spend a ton of time with leaders working on that one skill. First, because it's critical, and second, because most leaders are super uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, good point. Really good point. And a lot of people don't understand that most leaders or managers have other leaders and managers above them. So they're only replicating what they see above. And it's all about sort of controlling the information that goes above versus below, and really don't have the autonomy to sort of run their own ship and be their own person as well. So you find a lot of organizations, the culture of, keeping things hidden and, the less is more, and not, it's just a strange world we live in. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of leading remotely and this whole thing about how offices have shut down around the world with mandates and people working from home, and we're not going to see the end of this, and how leaders can, effectively lead their teams remotely. Talk also about, employees, how they're experiencing email fatigue and things of that nature. So could you deep dive a little bit into leading remotely and this new epidemic of working from home? And
yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge for so many leaders, and I know for a lot of companies, at least here in the States, we have really seen a switch to, a lot of companies have just made the call they're not going to go back. They're going to stay remote. They've seen the value in the remote space. They're going to save on the real estate costs of, carrying a building to put people in. They saw that people could be effective from home. So there are a couple challenges that leaders are facing with that. And I really think, and this is not something that's talked about in the book because it hadn't happened yet. This kind of great resignation that we're experiencing right now, a lot of that is being driven by people who are at extreme levels of burnout, and that burnout is not being addressed by their organization. And that is things like, I was just having a conversation with a client the other day about Zoom just suddenly became the norm. Like, we're all just going to jump on Zoom, and Zoom's great. Zoom's a great way to actually look at somebody's eyes and have a conversation, but not every meeting needs to be a Zoom. We used to call each other. Phones are great too. You can also text or instant messages. Like, there's all these different methods that we can be using. But for a lot of organizations, Zoom has suddenly become the gold standard. And I think part of that was out of a need to monitor employees, just truth telling. I think there are certainly some organizations that saw Zoom as a way to visually see that you've got employees that are working every day and they're not, at home, watching Netflix. But I think we have to step away from that, and we have to really take a hard look at communication channels and really be intentional about what types of information are we communicating through what channel. And I think that will really be helpful as we continue to navigate this remote space, as a lot of companies go to either fully remote or hybrid forever. Those are going to be some things that we continue to have to try to evaluate how they're working and what really the best choice is for the people involved.
Yeah. Thanks for expanding. And it's not going away. And it's one of those interesting things of, what is the required outcome of employee at home? Like, I always find it fascinating where, people go to these cities and go to the offices. What are they doing? They're either doing phone, email, meetings, pushing paper, doing something online. Most of our jobs now, if you look at these big office towers, what are they doing? Essentially computer, email, phone, meetings, all these things can be done at home. We're not actually doing physical labor. So I don't know, it's just a strange sort of shift, but with everything that happened around the world the last couple of years, it's really accelerated the need of, hang on, we don't need these big office buildings, and the most things we do can be done at home and remotely as well. And technology is good, but too much technology is bad as well. Yeah, so moving on, in the book, part 2, you talk about principles of a prepared leader. Can you talk a little bit about sort of extreme self-awareness in the book? You jump through, what is sort of extreme self-awareness with leaders?
Yeah, I think so. So basically, this part of the book, what I tried to do is key in on 7 things that I think are really, really critical for leaders to make sure that they're putting some time and attention around. And I started with this concept of extreme self-awareness because, in my opinion, this is the one that, you can get away with maybe a lower level of self-awareness for a while as a leader, but there's going to be a level or a time when that's just, it's going to end up being your undoing. And I've seen too many leaders kind of implode at a certain career level because they didn't keep their eye on the self-awareness piece. So self-awareness is really all about knowing what you're good at, knowing what you're not, knowing what you value, knowing why you're a leader and why you want to do this work. Those are all really critical components of it. But the important thing for leaders to think about when it comes to self-awareness is, what are the practices that you have in your life to keep your eye on this? Self-awareness is not something that we can be like, okay, I'm self-aware, check mark. It's a constant thing. Your next blind spot's like, it's lurking right over there. So what are you doing to make sure that you've got something in place to try to catch that as quickly as possible? So that could be something like making sure that you have really great mentors in your life that actually see you in action. So that, mentors outside your organization are great. That's really helpful. But having a peer or a higher up leader who sees you in action with your team in meetings, whatever that looks like, so that you can be getting feedback from someone that you trust in a way that you can hear about things that you need to know about. I still remember I have this really clear picture in my head of some feedback that I got when I first started at the CIA, where there's a practice at the CIA of something called backbenching. So I was backbenching where, you've got all these kind of higher up people at the table, and I was along the wall. And basically your job is, if you're along the wall, is if something happens that maybe something needs a deeper dive where you're the person who has that information, then you would get invited to, speak up. But mostly you're just like a wallflower at this meeting. That's just kind of a cultural thing that happens there. And so I was backbenching, and my leader just happened to be like across from me. So she could see me at this meeting. And I don't know, I don't even remember what happened at the meeting, but whatever it was, I must have been super disgusted about, because apparently my face just completely changed. I got really irritated. Like, it was really clear by what was happening on my face that I was upset about it. So after the meeting, she was like, Beth, you're a rock star. You're one of my favorite employees, but you got to watch your face in those meetings, girl, because like somebody's going to see that as either disrespect or, not understand where that's coming from. And it was absolutely a blind spot for me. Obviously I don't have a mirror. I don't know what my face looks like. So that piece of, feedback was, just absolutely critical for me. And I think about it a lot. Of just being really conscious of what am I doing with my face when somebody is saying something that I disagree with. So it's having people like that who can shine a light on those things. And also giving yourself space regularly to just pause and think about what's been going really well, what's been a disaster, and really trying to diagnose trends and what are you seeing and why.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing it. It makes so much sense, and it's a good segue into your next chapter, which is resilience. And I like what you did. So as the pandemic settled in, you realized that most of your goals wouldn't happen, so you lost a little direction, like everyone did. And in an effort to motivate yourself in that fall, you started to take note on what goals you had accomplished that weren't on the list. And I'm not going to read the list out. People can read it with the book, but you became a certified resilience coach, all this other stuff as well. But number 10, which was survived. So you wrote down 10 things that you actually did, which was great. And that was on my list as well. And I think on a lot of people's list, it survived as well. Can you deep dive a little bit into resilience?
Yeah, I think resilience is another one that it's easy to lose sight of. And I also came across some really fascinating research that most of us think we are much more resilient than we actually are. So you might rate yourself as, I'm an 8 out of 10 in resilience. But if you really looked at it, maybe you're a 4 or 5 out of 10. But we tend to overestimate how resilient we truly are. So it's another one that's a really good idea to keep an eye on. But resilience is really all about, I like to call it the bounce forward. So like something happens, our goal is to not just bounce back, but hopefully bounce forward. So how can you continue to move forward on the things that are the most important to you, even when things go wrong? And knowing that, maybe that takes you a second to shake it off, but you're able to shake it off and still do the things that matter to you.
Yeah, and just a quick cap on sort of the 6 domains of resilience. So you talk about resilience as vision, it's composure, collaboration, reasoning, tenacity, and health. And each of these factors in combination make up our overall resilience as well. Yeah, great little recap through there. Chapter 6, you deep dive into results orientated as well. And you don't get results by focusing on results, you get results by focusing on actions that produce results. Can you talk a little bit about being results orientated sort of as a leader as well?
Yeah, I think this is another one that maybe it's in the back of your mind as a leader, but how often do you think about, okay, what kind of results am I getting? Am I tracking results? Am I, again, focused on holding other people accountable? Am I setting goals and a vision in a way that people are inspired by and can move forward by? And this particular chapter, one of my favorite pieces of research that I found was a Harvard Business Review study that actually found that they were wondering about like perception of others. So what makes somebody think that you're a really great leader? And so they asked, if somebody's really focused on results, how often do you think they're a great leader? So the number there was like 14%, was fairly low if you're just results focused or just seen as results focused. And then they asked, okay, if you're just seen as like a social leader, so you have high social skills, that connection piece of working with others, what was the percentage there? And I think it was something like 12%. But if you had both those things, if you had the results focus and you were had those high social skills, so you were able to connect with others, your likelihood of being seen as a good leader was 72%. So it goes through the roof if you can focus in on both of those things. The sad news of that study is that when they dug into, okay, how many leaders actually have that? 1% of leaders have that combination, which at first I saw it and I was like, is that true? Like that, man, that feels low. But again, when you really dig into what it takes to do those two things, part of that is, again, this thing we already talked about, which is a feedback conversation. The combination of results focus and social skills, that's a feedback conversation at its core. Like that's the moment. And I think about how many leaders I know that struggle with that skill set. Yeah, the 1% makes more sense now, right? Like that is true. A lot of people struggle with that. So I think that's a really interesting study, and also just really informs, again, how important having both is.
And I can see why having, preparing great leaders or working with leaders can actually, change dynamics completely as well. Like as we said before, bad leaders, people leave bad leaders and bad cultures, but building up good leaders and the next set of leaders and managers, employees and good employees as well. So, making sure that carries on as well, and changing the culture around, good leadership, and making sure that we can practice that as well, and understanding what good leadership is. Chapter 7, you jump into sort of building trust, how important it is to build trust. And one of the little stats you talk about is the United States Army post-World War II research revealed that those military units that had high trust and confidence in their unit leaders showed a low rate of combat fatigue and shell shock. And conversely, those units whose soldiers reported that they neither trusted nor they liked their leaders showed an extremely high rate of combat fatigue or shell shock, sometimes as much as 10 times more than the units who trusted their leaders as well. Is there anything you want to add on that or expand on sort of building trust?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite pieces of research in the book, that study. And that term shell shock, that's kind of old school terminology. We call that PTSD now, like that's got a clinical diagnosis. But that study actually started in the 70s during Vietnam. They were noticing as soldiers came back, gosh, we've got folks that seem to be experiencing these symptoms, and a lot of them are coming from the same unit. So they got really curious about what could be happening. Like, is it the types of situations these people were in, or what happened? And they found it was leaders. And I thought that was really fascinating, and again, makes a ton of sense based on what I know about the impact of leaders. The interesting thing there is especially in those types of military environments, one of the things that military members said really mattered to them is not just that I trusted that leader, but I trusted that leader valued my life and was going to make good decisions and keep me safe, and communicated that to me regularly. And again, that seems like a no-brainer. Wouldn't every military leader do that? But they found a lot of military leaders weren't. And so that's actually something that's been built into military training now, and is something that I've seen just myself really permeate that culture, and has been a really big win for, I know, our U.S. military organizations. I think those numbers have shifted a lot.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And another analogy used in the book, if you think of trust as making deposits and withdrawals in a bank account or piggy bank, the more deposits you place, the more likely that the relationship is to survive when you start withdrawals happen as well. And that's just got to do with relationships too, like just say, your spouse or your partner or your whichever. The more trust is built on deposits, and the more deposits you put in there, you can withdraw from that. But if you're not depositing in a relationship and you keep taking, well, not only trust is going to, dissolve, but you're not going to have anything left to take out of the jar as well. But anyway, moving on, chapter 8, you talk about demonstrating empathy, and we touched on it before. And, leadership is about empathy. It's about having the ability to relate and connect with people for the purpose of inspiring and empowering others as well. That's an Oprah Winfrey quote. Can you talk a little bit about sort of empathy and how we need it in our day-to-day lives and also our workplace as well to, help cope with emotions, and how leaders can use empathy to better their teams?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this chapter. I happen to have a dear friend who spends most of her time working with companies on empathy practices. And so I interviewed her for this chapter, and she was kind enough to share some of her work with me. And part of what I think is interesting here, like empathy is important, like the feeling of it, the emotion of it is important, but there's a kind of skin in the game component of empathy. And part of that is, do you know how to communicate empathy to others? So do you know what to say? And secondly, do you know what to do? So let's say, Michael, your father just passed away and I work with you. Do I know how to be of service to you in an empathetic way? So do I know, it might be really helpful to Michael right now to have some meals provided to him and his family so that they don't have to worry about that. So can I be of service in that way? Or can I walk your dog? Or can I take your garbage out? Like whatever it is, can I be of service in some way to you? So knowing what you feel comfortable doing for somebody else, especially in the workplace, and having that kind of on the ready so that if something happens, you're ready to make that offer in a way that makes it really easy for that person to accept it. And then on the what to say front, so much of the what to say comes down to, first, if it's a cliche, don't say it. So if somebody's dad just passed away, don't say something like they're in a better place, or, that's just not a helpful form of empathy. One of the best things you can say is actually just to say, I'm so incredibly sorry, and I'm here, and I'd love to hear more about what you're going through, and I'm here to support you. And just lean into it that way. And I think for some of us, again, when you see somebody else go through something really hard, it can be triggering for us. It can be really, really hard. And so we kind of go to, when we get flustered, we go to like the last terrible thing somebody told us. So that suddenly comes out of our mouth. So it's really easy to kind of get into empathy misses because we just don't have that skill set like deep in our bones. So just leaning into that. And using it as often as you can when those situations pop up is really huge with empathy.
Yeah, and it's also practicing empathy on a daily basis instead of waiting for those moments where you have to actually show empathy. Then it's quite weird for someone to show empathy if they never show it daily. And those moments that happen, and then you have that hard leader that tries to be soft, and you're like, hang on a sec, this doesn't seem genuine or sincere. This is not match at all. To round off, and I'll let people read the book as well. It's an amazing book, and go out and buy it. But just the last one, chapter 9, you talk about communicate. There's a lot of great things through there as well. And with what's happening in the world, we use email, texting, phone calls, one-on-one meetings, team meetings, video calls, instant messaging. There's so many ways we communicate, but can you sort of just recap communicating well, and how we can use communication to better our lives, and as leaders as well, how we can create better teams?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that I found for people who've read the book, or who are kind of working their way through it as a leader, one of the tools I've gotten a lot of feedback on is I have this map in the book of kind of just think about like, how are you using these different methods that you have, the ones you mentioned. So how are we using email? How are we using instant messages? All the different forms, whatever it is. And I think culturally for a lot of us, what tends to happen is we use email because like culturally, that's just what everybody does. And it's really easy. I can just fire off an email to you. But what happens again, if we're looking at things like burnout, people are just drowning in email, and email is just not that effective of a form of communication. It's great for like a short, quick, I've got this thing. Fine. It's not great for communicating large quantities of information. It's not great for crisis situations when something needs to be dealt with really quickly. So I think for leaders, the best tip I can give you with communication is really get intentional about how you're using these methods, and get really clear with your team about what your expectations are around this. So instead of just default, like the more you respond to every team email that somebody on your team sends, the more they think that's what you want them to do, when maybe you would prefer them to text you or send you instant message or call you. So to the extent that you can control, certainly you have a lot of control over your own team, really take a hard look at how are you using those methods? Are they working? And if not, what are some things that you might want to experiment with and tweak to see if it makes a difference in your day-to-day? Because I think, long term, we have to get out of this relationship that we all seem to have with email. It's a toxic relationship. So
I think soon we'll be in the metaverse, and it's going to be a complete new story and books coming out of that as well. But
probably true. That's probably true.
Beth, I'll sort of wrap it up through there, but I appreciate your time and thank you for being on the Best Book Bits podcast. One last question: where can people find the book, buy the book, and if they want to connect with you, you've got coaching programs as well. How can they sort of reach out to you as well? What's the best place online?
Best place to buy the book is Amazon.com. It's Crisis Proof Leadership. You can also find it on Barnes & Noble, some other big sites. So Google, see if your favorite bookseller is selling it. It's available in paperback, audiobook, and ebook. So you can pick your favorite format on those platforms. And if you'd love to connect with me, I'm on Instagram. My handle is Beth_Rashleigh_author. I'd love to connect with you there. Also really active on LinkedIn. You're welcome to connect there. I'm Beth Rashleigh. And my website is Rashleigh Consulting, Rashleigh. And there's actually a specific page for the book. So if you grab a copy of the book and dig into it, I have some free resources there that might be helpful for you. So you might check those out. And I'd love to connect with you in any of those formats.
Legend. Thank you, Beth, for being a guest on the Best Book Bits podcast. My audience, go out, follow Beth, buy her book, read it. It is fantastic. And we'll speak to you soon. Thanks very much.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Michael.
Speak to you soon.